The silent rejection. Tasha King adjusted her seatbelt, letting out a deep breath as the airplane doors closed behind her. She was en route to a well-deserved vacation, a brief escape from her demanding job as a senior executive at one of the top tech companies in the world. At 26 years old, Tasha had already accomplished more than most people could ever dream of, graduating at the top of her Ivy League class and rising quickly through the ranks of a competitive industry. She had become a force to be reckoned with. The hum of the airplane's engines brought a sense of calm to her, a feeling of being momentarily untethered from the fast-paced world she had come to dominate. She had earned this time for herself, away from the conference calls, board meetings, and the never-ending pressure of leadership. This was her time to unwind, to relax, to recharge. As Tasha leaned back in her seat, she glanced around at the other passengers boarding the plane. Most were busy settling in, some glancing at their phones, others chatting quietly with their travel companions. Tasha, however, was used to being the youngest person in any room, even on this plane. The tech world was a competitive one, and though she had made her mark, the stares of people who judged her based on her age and race had become a routine part of her life. What Tasha didn't expect, though, was to find herself in the middle of a tense, highly scrutinized situation just moments later. It all began when Samantha, a flight attendant with a sharp, calculating gaze, stopped by her aisle. Tasha, who had always been polite and composed, smiled up at the attendant, hoping to engage in some light small talk. But Samantha, her lips drawn tight, spoke in a manner that didn't leave much room for pleasantries. "I need you to step out of your seat, miss," Samantha said, her tone professional but carrying an unmistakable edge. Tasha blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, is there a problem?" Samantha's gaze flickered briefly to the seating area behind her before she looked down at Tasha, her voice firm. "I'm afraid I'm going to need to ask you to leave the plane." Tasha's heart skipped a beat. What was happening? She had followed all the instructions and had been nothing but courteous to everyone, including the flight crew. "I don't understand," Tasha said, her voice betraying a hint of disbelief. "Why do I have to leave? What did I do?" Samantha didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to her colleagues, whispering something inaudible, before returning her gaze to Tasha. "It's just company policy, miss. You've caused a disruption. We've had complaints about your behavior." A sense of dread crept over Tasha, and the questions began to pile up in her mind. What complaints? Who complained? What did I do? "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, her voice steady. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't been disruptive. Tasha had followed every rule. What was going on? Without further explanation, Samantha motioned for two security personnel to approach. One of them, a large man with a no-nonsense expression, stepped forward and addressed Tasha in a calm but firm voice. "Ma'am, we need you to exit the plane." The words hit her like a brick. Tasha had been flying for years. Never once had she encountered any issues, not even with the most difficult of passengers. Why was she being singled out? Was this some kind of mistake? The other passengers watched in silence, some confused, others perhaps even unsure of what they were witnessing. Tasha could feel the heat of their eyes on her, but none spoke up. None offered support. As she slowly stood, her mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. What could she have possibly done to deserve this? Her breath caught in her throat as the security personnel guided her down the aisle toward the plane's exit. She wanted to protest, to demand answers, but she didn't want to make things worse. Not now. Not when she didn't even understand what was happening. Outside the plane, the bustling noise of the airport felt like a sharp contrast to the strange, uncomfortable silence she had experienced inside. Security led her to a small private area near the terminal where she was told to wait. Tasha stood there, still in disbelief, feeling the weight of being targeted for reasons she didn't understand. She pulled out her phone to call her assistant, but realized the call wouldn't go through. There was no signal in the restricted area. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Tasha was alone with her thoughts, none of them making sense. She had never felt this humiliated before, and it stung her pride in ways she had never experienced. The feelings of confusion and frustration bubbled inside her, but she fought to remain calm. She would get to the bottom of this. She had to. Meanwhile, inside the plane, Samantha stood near the gate, explaining the decision to her colleagues. She was asking for special treatment, Samantha claimed, her voice low but clear, demanding more than she was entitled to. The complaints we received mentioned her causing a disturbance earlier. She was insistent and rude. It's a final decision. She has to go. But what Samantha didn't know, what no one knew, was that Tasha King wasn't just any passenger. The owner of the airline, Miles Henderson, was a man who had built his empire from the ground up, and his daughter, Tasha, was known within the industry, though most people had no idea she was the one behind the scenes making powerful decisions. To the staff, she was just another passenger, but to Tasha, this was more than just a misunderstanding. This was something deeper. Tasha King was not someone who could be dismissed so easily. As she waited outside, her thoughts turned inward, grappling with the realization that her identity, her success, her race, her age, was being weaponized against her. The crowd's murmurs continued in the background, unsure of what to make of the scene unfolding before them. But one thing was certain. Tasha's removal from the plane wasn't just about what she had or hadn't done. This moment, the injustice of it, was a catalyst that would change everything. Behind the curtain, Tasha stood at the edge of the airport terminal, her heart still racing. The cold air from the open door cut through her jacket as she crossed her arms, trying to hold herself together. She felt her fingers tingle with anxiety, but she refused to show weakness. The embarrassment of being escorted off the plane, her every move scrutinized by the silent witnesses, was a stinging reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control. There were questions in the air, but no answers. Why was I removed? What did I do? She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words felt stuck in her throat. What good would it do to fight now when the system was already working against her? She had been nothing but calm, composed, and professional. But somewhere along the way, those qualities had been weaponized against her. Tasha took in a shaky breath and pulled out her phone again, hoping for a signal. As her thumb hovered over her contacts, a sudden realization hit her. She could call her father. Miles Henderson, the owner of Henderson Airlines. Her father's empire was a monumental achievement, and his success was something that people across the industry whispered about in awe. He had built this airline from the ground up, fought battles, overcome obstacles, and earned a reputation that made him a giant in the business world. But Tasha's involvement in the family business was not common knowledge. People knew of Henderson Airlines, but they didn't know the woman behind the scenes, the woman who quietly made powerful decisions that affected the company's trajectory. Her hand hovered over his number again, but a strange hesitation filled her. Calling him now, after being humiliated like this, felt like an admission of defeat. She didn't want her father to think she couldn't handle herself. She'd fought too hard to prove that she was more than just his daughter. She was her own woman, her own success story. But then a thought flitted through her mind. What if this wasn't about me at all? What if the real reason she had been removed from the plane was because of something deeper, something systemic, something that had nothing to do with her actions and everything to do with the way people perceived her? She was, after all, a young black woman in a position of power, a combination that often made people uncomfortable. In her world, in her industry, she was an anomaly. And anomalies, particularly ones that defied expectations, were often met with resistance. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a glimpse into the harsh, unspoken biases that lingered beneath the surface, even in places she had once believed were above reproach. Just then, a familiar face appeared in the doorway. It was one of the airport security officers who had escorted her off the plane. He looked uneasy, his eyes scanning the room as if unsure whether he was doing the right thing. "Miss King," he said, his voice low. The staff has asked you to wait here while they process everything. We'll be in touch shortly." Tasha didn't answer right away. She was processing the situation herself. She had been sitting on a plane, ready to relax, and now here she was, alone, isolated, without a clear understanding of why she was being treated this way. But one thing she knew for certain was that she wouldn't let this go. Not like this. She wasn't going to be a silent victim in someone else's game. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "But I'd like to speak to someone in charge." The officer hesitated before nodding. "I'll let them know. Just stay put for now." As he turned and walked away, Tasha felt her pulse quicken. What happens next? What will they say? The minutes stretched on like hours. Tasha paced in the small, cramped area, trying to keep her thoughts organized. She had to make a decision, one that would determine the course of the rest of her life. Tasha's mind wandered back to her early years. Growing up, she had been taught to keep her head down, to work harder than anyone else, and to prove that she was worthy of her place in the world. She had always been the only black woman in any room she entered, and yet she had never let that stop her from achieving her goals. Whether it was acing her classes or closing million-dollar deals, Tasha had never let her race, her gender, or her age define her. But here, now she was faced with a stark reminder of just how deeply ingrained societal biases could be. This wasn't about her qualifications or her status. This was about how people perceived her, how they judged her at first glance. Samantha, the flight attendant, had seen only a young black woman sitting in first class, and to her that didn't belong. What if it wasn't just a misunderstanding? What if it was something more? Suddenly, a voice broke through her reverie. "Tasha King." The voice was familiar but laced with authority. Tasha turned to see the airport manager, a tall man in his mid-40s, walking briskly toward her. He was dressed in the airline's uniform, his name tag reading Robert Grant. "I'm Robert Grant," he said, offering her a hand. "I'm the airport operations manager. I understand you've had a difficult experience today." Tasha didn't shake his hand immediately. Instead, she narrowed her eyes, searching his face for any hint of apology or accountability. "I was removed from the plane," she said, her voice firm. "Without explanation, without cause. I demand to know why." Grant took a deep breath, his expression momentarily flickering before he spoke. "I understand your frustration, Ms. King. I'll be honest with you. We received a report from one of our flight attendants, Samantha, stating that you were being disruptive, asking for special treatment." Tasha blinked in disbelief. "Disruptive," she repeated. "I wasn't disruptive. I had my boarding pass. I followed all instructions. This doesn't make sense." "I know this is hard to believe," Grant said, his voice softening slightly. "But when someone reports an issue, we have to act. I don't have all the details yet, but I promise we're reviewing the situation. I'll have a full report for you as soon as possible." Tasha fought the urge to laugh bitterly. This wasn't just a mistake. It couldn't be. What she was being told didn't add up, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was being carefully hidden. There was something deeper going on, something that had nothing to do with her behavior and everything to do with how people saw her. Before she could respond, Grant added, "You should know that we are taking this matter seriously. We're investigating, and will take any appropriate actions based on the findings." Tasha's lips pressed into a thin line as she met his gaze. "I'll be waiting for your explanation," she said, her voice cold but resolute. As she walked away from the airport manager, Tasha's thoughts turned inward once again. She had never expected to find herself in a situation like this, humbled, confused, and dismissed. But one thing was clear: she wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. Tasha King had always risen above the odds, and this time she was going to make sure she wouldn't be silenced. She wouldn't be forgotten. Her father had built an empire, but she was going to tear down the walls that kept her and so many others from true equality. It was time to fight back. The hidden bias, Tasha King stared out the window of the airport's restricted lounge, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edges of her phone. It had been nearly an hour since she had last spoken with Robert Grant, the airport manager. Still, no one had come to explain what had happened on the plane, and the unease in her chest was slowly growing into something more solid, more visceral. She sat in silence, her mind racing over the events that had unfolded earlier. Disruptive. That was what they had called her. But the more Tasha thought about it, the less she believed it. She had never once raised her voice, never once demanded anything that wasn't part of the standard procedures for first-class passengers. She had followed every rule, every guideline, yet here she was isolated, confused, and humiliated. But something else was gnawing at her, a feeling deep in her gut that this wasn't just about her actions or anything she had done. No, this was something much bigger, something insidious. She was starting to wonder if her presence on that plane, her mere existence, had caused a reaction in the flight crew, something they couldn't or didn't want to acknowledge. Was it possible that I was treated like this because of who I am? The thought struck her like a bolt of lightning, and she felt her chest tighten. She was, after all, young, black, and successful, three qualities that for some made her an anomaly in a world that hadn't fully learned to embrace change. In an industry dominated by older, predominantly white figures, she had managed to carve out a place for herself. But what if that success had created enemies? What if her very presence, her very ambition, was enough to make people uncomfortable? Tasha shook her head, pushing the thought aside. It was hard to imagine that something as simple as her race could be enough to make someone single her out. And yet, the more she examined the situation, the more it seemed like it could be the answer. The flight attendant, Samantha, hadn't hesitated. She had made her decision quickly and without question. It was as if she had already decided who Tasha was before they had ever spoken. Her thoughts were interrupted when the door to the lounge opened, and a man in a sharp suit entered. He was middle-aged, with salt and pepper hair, and an air of authority that instantly commanded attention. Tasha stood up as he approached, already knowing who he was. This had to be the person in charge, the airline executive who had been sent to smooth things over. Tasha King. The man's voice was calm but firm. "I'm John O'Reilly, Senior Vice President of Operations here at Henderson Airlines. I've been briefed about your situation. I'd like to talk with you, if you're willing." Tasha gave a slight nod, her eyes narrowing as she sized him up. She was tired of apologies and excuses. She needed answers, and she needed them now. "Please, have a seat," O'Reilly said, motioning to the chairs. "I understand you've had an unfortunate experience, and I'm here to get to the bottom of it." Tasha sat down but didn't relax. Her posture remained stiff, her gaze unwavering as she looked directly at him. "I was removed from my flight for no reason, Mr. O'Reilly. A flight attendant claimed I was disruptive, but I don't understand how that could be the case. I followed every procedure, I was polite, and I've always been respectful to your crew. So, why was I singled out?" O'Reilly paused for a moment, seemingly contemplating his next words carefully. "I understand your frustration, Tasha, and I want to assure you that this is being taken very seriously. We've launched an internal investigation into the matter. But sometimes, situations like these are more complex than they appear on the surface. We've interviewed the staff involved, and according to them, there were concerns about your behavior. They mentioned that you were making excessive demands, asking for accommodations that weren't available, and that this escalated the situation." Tasha felt a rush of heat rise to her face, a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Accommodations? I was flying first class. What more could I have possibly asked for? I didn't ask for anything beyond what any other passenger in first class would expect." O'Reilly leaned forward slightly, his gaze softening. "I'm not here to accuse you, Tasha. I'm just saying that sometimes perceptions can cloud the truth. What might seem like an innocent request to one person might come off as something else entirely to another. Sometimes, it's not the action, but how it's interpreted that leads to problems." Tasha clenched her fists, holding her temper in check. She had been in enough boardrooms and high-stakes meetings to know how people tried to downplay uncomfortable situations. Perceptions, interpretations. It sounded like code for something she didn't want to hear. "Are you telling me," she said slowly, her voice cold, "that the issue here wasn't what I did or didn't do, but how people perceived me? Is that really what you're saying?" O'Reilly hesitated, and for a brief moment, the mask of professionalism slipped. "What I'm saying is that sometimes unconscious biases can influence people's decisions. We live in a world where judgments are often made based on superficial factors: age, race, gender, and unfortunately, those biases can shape how people respond in certain situations. It's something we've been trying to address in our training programs, but it's not something that's easy to fix." Tasha's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't wanted to hear that, but in a way, she already knew it. She had spent her whole life fighting against the stereotypes that people try to impose on her. She had worked harder than anyone to prove that she belonged, that she was just as capable as anyone else. And yet here she was, treated like an outsider, an anomaly, just because she didn't fit into the mold that others had created for her. For a moment, she let the weight of those words sink in. She had always been a fighter, and she wasn't about to let this be the end of the story. No, this was just the beginning. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Tasha asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. O'Reilly's expression tightened. "We will conduct a full investigation into the flight crew's actions. If we find that any of the staff were discriminatory in their treatment of you, we will take appropriate action. I promise you that." Tasha didn't feel reassured. She had heard all of this before, too many times. The promises, the apologies, the assurances, they never led to real change. "I don't want promises, Mr. O'Reilly," Tasha said firmly, her eyes narrowing. "I want accountability. I want to know that this airline is willing to look itself in the mirror and recognize the ways in which it's failing to treat people like me with respect. This isn't just about me. This is about every black woman, every young professional who's been made to feel like they don't belong. You can't just sweep this under the rug." O'Reilly looked taken aback by her intensity. For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of her words hanging in the air. He cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "I understand your point, Tasha, and I'll do everything in my power to ensure that this doesn't happen again. But the reality is, biases are deep-seated in society. It's a long road ahead, but we're committed to doing better." Tasha stood up, her gaze never leaving his. "Doing better isn't enough. You need to be actively dismantling these systems. Otherwise, it's just lip service." With that, she turned and walked toward the door, leaving O'Reilly behind, her resolve stronger than ever. This fight was just beginning, and Tasha was ready to take it all the way to the top. No one, not even an airline as powerful as Henderson Airlines, was going to silence her. Not now. Not ever. Revelations and reckonings. The following days after her confrontation with John O'Reilly were a blur for Tasha. She had expected to hear back quickly, to receive some kind of apology, or at the very least, a clear explanation for the events that had transpired. But instead, she found herself trapped in a silence that felt oppressive, suffocating. No calls, no emails, no further communication from the airline. It was as if they were hoping the incident would disappear on its own, that it would fade away like so many injustices before it. But Tasha wasn't one to let things go easily. She wasn't built that way. Every day she spent waiting only added fuel to the fire that burned inside her. Her thoughts were consumed by what had happened on that plane, the inexplicable humiliation and the clear discrimination that seemed to have been wrapped in the guise of professionalism. The more she replayed the events, the more certain she became. This was no accident. This was intentional, a reflection of the biases that ran deep not only in Henderson Airlines, but in the industry as a whole. Tasha knew she couldn't just sit back and wait for answers. She had to take action, and she would, in the most powerful way she knew how. Her father, Miles Henderson had built an empire. He had faced prejudice, discrimination, and setbacks of his own, things that most people couldn't even fathom. And yet, he had risen above it all, creating a legacy that changed the face of the aviation world. Tasha had been raised with the understanding that there was nothing she couldn't accomplish. But the world was a lot more complicated than she had thought. She didn't want to involve her father. Not because she didn't trust him, but because this was her fight, her battle to wage. She wasn't going to use his name to get ahead. She wanted to carve out her own path. But this situation was different. It was beyond her. She needed to make sure her voice was heard. And if that meant reaching out to her father, then so be it. It wasn't long before Tasha was seated at her father's massive oak desk in his luxurious home office. The walls were lined with framed awards, business deals, and photographs of his most significant accomplishments. Despite the overwhelming success of his business, Miles Henderson was a man who remained grounded, focused on his goals and driven by the same fire that had propelled him all those years. But today, as Tasha sat across from him, she saw something different in his eyes. There was a weight to his gaze, a quiet understanding that she had been struggling with something deep inside. "What's going on, Tasha?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "You've barely slept, and I know that something's been bothering you. What's happening?" Tasha took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before speaking. Her father had always been her pillar of strength, but even now, she felt the need to fight for herself, to stand on her own. But this moment, was about something bigger than her. It was about the system that had shaped the world she had fought so hard to succeed in. "Dad, I was kicked off a plane last week," she began, her voice steady but laced with a quiet anger. "I was treated like a criminal, humiliated in front of a crowd of people, and I'm still waiting for answers. I'm not going to let this go." Her father's brow furrowed as he listened intently, his expression serious. "You were what?" he asked, clearly taken aback. "I was removed from a flight for no reason." Tasha continued, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "I was polite. I followed all the rules, and yet the flight attendants claimed I was being disruptive and asked me to leave. I don't believe it was about my behavior. I think it's about something else." Miles leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his face as he processed her words. He had faced his own share of bias and bigotry during his rise to power. He knew how insidious discrimination could be, how deeply it was woven into the fabric of society. But hearing his daughter's story, hearing it from her own lips, struck a chord that went deeper than anything he had experienced. "Do you think it's because of who you are?" he asked quietly. "Because you're young, black, a woman in a leadership role?" Tasha didn't need to answer. She saw the pain in his eyes, the understanding that his daughter was facing a battle he had hoped she would never have to fight. But it was the world they lived in. Even in a time when they thought things had changed, some people's perceptions hadn't. Some people still saw Tasha as something other than a young, capable leader. They saw her as a threat, as a challenge. "I didn't want to involve you in this," Tasha said, her voice softer now. "But I can't do this alone. I've tried, but the more I think about it, the more I realize how deep this goes. It's not just one flight attendant. It's not just one incident. This is the way people see me in the world. It's how they see all of us. And if I don't speak up, no one will." Her father looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, with a slow nod, he stood up and walked around the desk to stand beside her. "You're right," he said, his voice strong but tinged with regret. "This is bigger than one flight, one airline. This is about something that needs to be confronted. You've worked hard to get where you are, Tasha. But that doesn't mean the world is going to just hand you respect because you've earned it. You're going to have to fight for it. And I'll help you." The weight of his words settled in the room like a heavy blanket. Tasha had never been one to back down from a fight, but hearing her father speak this way, offering his support without hesitation, felt like both a relief and a burden. She had always wanted to be her own person, to prove that she didn't need anyone's help. But she was starting to understand that sometimes strength came from unity. It wasn't just about standing alone. It was about standing together. "I don't want to play the victim, Dad," Tasha said, her voice steady once more. "But I'm not going to let this stand. I need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Her father's gaze softened, his expression both proud and solemn. "I know you, Tasha, and I've always known that you would fight for what's right. If anyone can change this, it's you." Tasha took a deep breath and stood up, a new sense of determination swelling inside her. She wasn't going to wait for answers anymore. She wasn't going to let anyone silence her. She was going to change the game, one decision at a time. But first, she would make sure that her voice was heard, loud and clear. And she would hold everyone accountable, starting with Henderson Airlines. Because the fight wasn't just hers, it was for everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or discriminated against. And Tasha King wasn't going to stop until the world saw her for who she truly was, a force to be reckoned with. The power of exposure. The days after her conversation with her father, Miles Henderson, were filled with an urgency that Tasha hadn't felt in a long time. She had been the face of change in the tech industry, climbing the ranks and earning respect from colleagues who saw her not just as a young black woman, but as a powerhouse in her own right. But now, in the face of this unjust treatment, she was ready to confront the very system that sought to diminish her at every turn. The moment she left her father's office, the weight of the situation became clear. She had always known how deeply ingrained biases were in society, but being the target of such an obvious form of discrimination, especially in an environment where she had expected to be respected, was something entirely different. This wasn't just about her. It was about dismantling the biases that had been embedded in institutions for years, and if she didn't speak out, the cycle would continue. But Tasha wasn't going to let that happen. She immediately reached out to her team, pulling together a group of trusted advisors, lawyers, and communications experts. The goal was clear. The world needed to know the truth about what had happened on that plane. If she was going to fight this battle, she was going to do it in the open, where no one could hide behind a curtain of silence. Tasha's team worked around the clock. They started by investigating the full details of the incident, gathering evidence, speaking with witnesses, and reaching out to the passengers who had been on the flight. Every piece of information was scrutinized. But what she found disturbed her even more than she had imagined. The flight attendants who had reported her had given inconsistent accounts of the situation. Some described her as demanding, while others suggested she had been rude, terms that didn't match up with the composed, professional behavior Tasha had exhibited. Even more concerning was the fact that Samantha, the flight attendant who had made the initial call to remove Tasha from the plane, had a history of making similar reports against black passengers, particularly those who held positions of power. It was clear that there was more to this than a simple misunderstanding. As Tasha pored over the documents, she could feel the anger building inside her, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced this kind of treatment. She wasn't just a victim in this moment. She was a symbol for all the voices that had been silenced, all the people who had been forced to walk away quietly when they were wronged. And she wasn't going to let that happen anymore. She made the decision to take it public. Tasha reached out to a few trusted journalists who had been vocal about issues of inequality in the workplace, particularly in the tech industry. She knew that putting this on a public stage would force the airline's hand. But more importantly, it would give her the platform she needed to speak out about the deeper, systemic issues she had faced. The story was picked up quickly. Media outlets from across the country began running stories about Tasha's removal from the plane, the accusations of discrimination, and her decision to take legal action against Henderson Airlines. The response was overwhelming. While some defended the airline's actions, others rallied behind Tasha, offering their support and sharing their own stories of discrimination in the workplace and on public transport. But what truly shocked Tasha was the response from within her own industry. Her peers in the tech world, most of whom were white men, reached out with messages of support, many expressing how they had seen firsthand the challenges she faced in a field that often viewed women of color as less than their counterparts. Tasha realized, for the first time, that she wasn't fighting this alone. Within 48 hours of her public statement, the pressure on Henderson Airlines began to mount. Her team had made sure that every part of the story was being scrutinized, from the inconsistency of the flight attendants' reports to the troubling pattern of discrimination that seemed to follow certain staff members. What was once an isolated incident was now the center of a national conversation about bias, race, and the treatment of marginalized people in positions of power. But it wasn't just about the media coverage, it was about what happened next. The CEO of Henderson Airlines, Michael Dawson, reached out to Tasha directly, requesting a meeting. It was clear that the public outcry had forced the airline's hand. But Tasha wasn't interested in simple apologies. She needed something concrete, real change, not just empty words. The meeting took place a week later in one of the company's high-rise offices, a sprawling suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Tasha arrived with her legal team, ready to face Dawson. But she wasn't intimidated. She had a clear vision of what needed to be done, and she wouldn't accept anything less. Dawson was seated at the head of a long table when Tasha entered. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a suit that looked like it had been tailored to perfection. He didn't rise when she walked in, instead offering a curt nod as she took her seat. Tasha sat tall, her posture exuding confidence as she fixed her gaze on him. "I'm glad you agreed to meet," Tasha said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm sure you understand why we're here." Dawson gave a tight-lipped smile. "I understand, Ms. King. I've read the reports, and I want to begin by offering my apologies for what happened on that plane. This is not the kind of incident we want associated with our airline." Tasha raised an eyebrow. "Apologies are nice, Mr. Dawson, but they don't change anything. I want action. I want a full investigation into the flight crew's actions. I want transparency, and I want to see real changes in your hiring and training processes. I also want Henderson Airlines to commit to a diversity and inclusion program that holds everyone accountable, from the flight attendants to the executives." Dawson's face shifted slightly, but he remained composed. "I assure you, Ms. King, we are already investigating the situation internally. We take these matters seriously." "Not seriously enough," Tasha replied, cutting him off. "You can't just sweep this under the rug. The fact that the flight attendants involved in this incident had a history of similar complaints should be a red flag. If we don't address that, nothing changes." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, and for a moment, Tasha thought Dawson might balk at her demands. But then he spoke, his tone grudgingly respectful. "You're right, Ms. King. There are changes that need to be made. I'll ensure that a third-party investigation takes place. We'll work to overhaul our training programs, and we'll address the issues with the staff involved. I can't undo what happened, but I can promise you that we'll take steps to make sure it doesn't happen again." Tasha didn't smile, but she felt a surge of satisfaction. This was the first time in her life that she had been able to hold an institution like Henderson Airlines accountable in such a direct way. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. "I'll be holding you to that," she said, "and I'll be watching closely." As she left the meeting, Tasha couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had gone up against one of the largest airlines in the world, and though the battle was far from over, she knew that things were beginning to change. The public was paying attention, the media was listening, and her voice was being heard. This fight wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been ignored, dismissed, and undervalued. It was about using the power of exposure to force a reckoning in a system that had long turned a blind eye to the very real issues of race, gender, and privilege. Tasha wasn't just making a statement. She was rewriting the rules. And this was only the beginning. The reckoning. The days following her meeting with Michael Dawson felt like a whirlwind. Tasha had expected resistance, had prepared herself for pushback, but what she didn't expect was how quickly the ripple effect would spread. It wasn't just the media coverage anymore. This was real change in motion. People were talking, questioning, and holding institutions accountable in ways they hadn't done before. Tasha's fight had become bigger than one flight, bigger than her. It had become a conversation that spanned industries, communities, and cities, touching on the uncomfortable truths that people had tried to ignore for far too long. As Tasha sat in her office, poring over the latest reports from her legal team and working with her communications department, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of urgency. This was her moment, and though she was tired, exhausted, even, she wasn't going to stop until she saw the tangible results she had fought for. The world was paying attention, and now was the time to push harder. The airline's third-party investigation into the incident was well underway. The pressure had built so intensely that Dawson had promised to make changes, real changes, within Henderson Airlines. Tasha had seen enough promises to last her a lifetime, but now, for the first time, she felt cautiously hopeful. She was being listened to, and that in itself was a step in the right direction. The company had pledged to implement a comprehensive diversity and inclusion program, overhaul their staff training, and institute an anonymous reporting system for any further incidents of discrimination. But Tasha knew that this couldn't just be about the airline. It had to be bigger than that. The larger issue, the systemic problem, was something that no one institution could solve on its own. It was something that had to be tackled on every front, within companies, within communities, and within society at large. She had spent years building her career in a space that often dismissed her because of her age, race, and gender, but now she was using that same space to tear down the barriers that had been built up for generations. Tasha knew that a single victory wouldn't be enough. She had to keep pushing, keep advocating for those whose voices had been silenced for far too long. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. This was a battle for justice, for equity, and for a future where people could rise based on their abilities and their character, not on the biases others held. Her phone buzzed, snapping her from her thoughts. It was a text from her assistant. "We've received an invitation to speak at the National Diversity and Inclusion Conference next month. They want you to be a keynote speaker. The press is eager to hear your side of the story." Tasha's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a small acknowledgement. This was the kind of platform she had dreamed about. The chance to speak to thousands of people, to share her journey, her frustrations, and her vision for change. This was her opportunity to make the largest impact she could. She quickly tapped a response, confirming her attendance. She wasn't sure what she would say yet, but she knew that the moment would come soon enough. She had to be prepared for what was to come. In the meantime, she kept pushing. She worked tirelessly on her initiatives, speaking with leaders across industries about how they could support a more inclusive environment. Tasha's influence had spread far beyond her position in tech and the airline industry. People were reaching out to her, asking for advice, guidance, and support. What was once an individual fight had turned into a collective movement. The week before the conference, Tasha received a call that made her pause. It was from one of the passengers who had been on the flight the day she was removed. A woman named Elizabeth, who had been sitting a few rows behind her, reached out with an apology. She had seen what had happened, but had said nothing in the moment. She explained that she hadn't known what to do, how to speak up, or if it was her place. She had been afraid of making waves. "I've been thinking about it nonstop," Elizabeth said, her voice shaky. "I should have said something. I should have stood up for you." Tasha was taken aback by the sincerity in her voice. "It's not too late to speak out," Tasha replied gently. "Your voice matters. You saw what happened, and people need to know the truth. The more of us that speak up, the more change we can create." Elizabeth agreed, and that conversation sparked something in Tasha. She wasn't fighting alone. There were so many who had witnessed injustice and remained silent, whether out of fear or uncertainty. Now, they were finding their voice, and it was time to amplify it. Tasha would speak not just for herself, but for everyone who had been too afraid to stand up for what was right. By the time Tasha arrived at the National Diversity and Inclusion Conference, the anticipation surrounding her speech was palpable. The conference hall was packed with executives, policymakers, activists, and thought leaders. As she walked onto the stage, a wave of applause washed over her, and for a brief moment, she felt the weight of the moment. But she knew that this wasn't about applause. This was about making sure that every person in that room, and everyone watching from around the world, understood what was at stake. She cleared her throat, adjusting the microphone, and began. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm Tasha King, and I'm here today because of an experience I had a few weeks ago on a plane. I was removed from that plane, not because of anything I did, but because of how I was perceived. I was treated like a threat, like a problem, simply because of who I am. A young black woman in first class. And for some reason, that was enough to make some people uncomfortable." Tasha paused, letting the words sink in. "I've spent my entire life proving that I belong in every space I occupy. I fought harder than anyone to get to where I am today. And yet, no matter how hard I work, no matter how successful I become, there will always be someone who looks at me and sees a stereotype instead of a person. This is not just my fight. This is a fight for everyone who has been marginalized, overlooked, and dismissed." She let out a slow breath before continuing, her eyes sweeping across the audience. "It's time we confront the truth. The biases that exist in every system, every institution, are real. And the longer we pretend they aren't there, the longer they will continue to hurt people like me. And like so many of you, we can't ignore this. We can't stay silent. It's time for all of us to rise up and create a world where no one is defined by the color of their skin, the gender they identify with, or the name they were born with. A world where our abilities, our character, our values, those are the things that define us." As Tasha spoke, she saw heads nodding, people leaning forward, hanging on her every word. She had their attention. She had earned it. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. This was her purpose, her calling. "I'm not here to tell you that the fight will be easy. It won't be. But I'm here to tell you that it is worth it. Every step we take toward justice, every time we speak out against injustice, we are making a difference. And that difference will ripple out, reaching those who need to hear it most." The applause that followed was deafening. But Tasha wasn't listening for the applause. She was listening to the promise she had made to herself, and to the countless others who had faced the same struggles. This was just the beginning. Tasha King wasn't done yet. She had only just begun to rewrite the rules.